Get out of the way, you bent old fool. Corporal Mason, 23, the sort who wore new leather like armor, stood with his gloves unused and his grin too loud. He banged the flank of a training challenger and told the yard the relic was taking up space. The lads behind him laughed, helmets skewed, voices bright and quick. Arthur Bennett, 82, moved with a slow, practiced economy that had nothing to do with frailty. His coveralls were softened where oil had lived longest, his knuckles set in pale lines that read like a ledger. He did not answer. He only checked a lug and let the yard make its noise. He rested a small hammer against the track and tapped once. A single, measured note. The metal answered with a hollow clarity, and the laughter thinned, pulled tight by a sound that carried meaning. A private frowned and then leaned forward, as if a map had been spoken aloud. Tom Harris, 22, watched with a careful hunger, the kind that keeps a man from laughing when others do. He had been on the line for 2 weeks and already borrowed manful gestures to look the part. When Arthur tapped again, Tom felt a muscle move in his chest, a recognition that had nothing to do with age. Sergeant Ellis, 38, folded a paper and watched the rhythm with the tired patience of a man who reads orders for a living. He did not smile. He only marked time with his thumb and made a note that looked small and sensible. The yard settled into the work of testing and preparation, because curiosity is its own kind of discipline. Arthur tapped a pattern that named pressure, not places, and he spoke once, naming a seam beneath the track. The men checked where he pointed and pushed a pry bar into the gap, hands moving with the blunt, efficient choreography of trained men. The metal shifted, and a wedge of compacted soil came away, proof without drama. Tom stole closer and kept his hands out of sight, palms open as if to hide eagerness. He produced, from the leather of his boot, a thin wooden wedge roughened by private use, and offered it without flourish. Arthur took it, turned it between thumb and forefinger, and tucked it into a pocket, as if keeping a found thing safe. Ellis ordered a fuller test on a second vehicle, a routine that felt suddenly important. The crew prepared straps and checked pins with brisk, functional motions, and the men moved like a single machine. Arthur walked the length of the track, his fingers brushing lugs the way a reader traces a line of print. When they worked together, Arthur's taps became directions, and the vehicle responded to the pattern, as if obeying a slow, secret language. The crew dug where he tapped, slackening earth and sliding grit away so the metal might seep through. The track eased with a small, telling groan, and a quiet passed through the yard like the settling of men who have learned to listen. A dented badge slipped from an inner pocket while Arthur bent to check a flank, and he caught it without comment. The badge was thin and soft, with years, and Arthur enclosed it with the rapid, private motion of someone who keeps memory in small things. No one asked, and no one needed to know the exact story, because proofs sometimes speak softer than explanations. Tom moved as if newly pledged, offering tools and rags with the awkward devotion of a man trying to be useful. Arthur accepted the help and worked with a lean economy, speaking only when necessary and letting the metal make statements instead. The men around them found themselves listening to rhythm and not to reputation. Ellis read the order that came down, folded the paper, and passed it along in a way that made the yard come to attention. The convoy would run a longer route, and Arthur would go with them. A simple directive that carried weight because it put the old man on the line. The announcement left a space of unfinished business, a thread that would not be left to hang. As they loaded the vehicles, men took positions with a sharper, quieter attention, checking straps and seats with practical fingers. Tom tucked his wedge into a pocket near his palm and kept glances toward Arthur, like a man mapping a teacher's motion. Arthur checked bolts once more and stood, the hammer hanging at his side as if waiting for a call. The yard fell into an expectant hush as the convoy prepared to move, the kind of silence that asks a question and expects an answer in movement. Men shouldered gear, and the final sound as they formed up was measured boots on the metal of steps. a cadence that promised action. They would find out if his rhythm could save a convoy, not just a tank. They left the yard with the quiet motion of people who know their stations. Arthur rode near the rear and kept his hands where metal was near, fingers that had spent years tracing lugs and seams. The convoy moved with practiced order, and men checked fast and without fuss. At a brief halt, Arthur tapped the track and said the name Sanh as if reading a label. Ellis straightened, as if a map had been named aloud, and the men fell into a listening hush. A private shifted his weight and looked at the ground as if expecting ink marks. Arthur spoke of pressure under a tread, measured in taps, not phrases. His words were spare, the way of someone who gives coordinates to do a job. Tom matched the rhythm in his head and found the cadence began to feel like a tool. They reached a training stretch where compact ground and old wheel ruts made judgment matter. The lead vehicle stuck, its drive whining as the tracks dug but did not take. Men pushed and strained, the easy bravado giving way to blunt effort. Arthur asked them to stop and to listen. He tapped twice and named a seam under the nearer track, and the crew set a pry bar where he indicated. Hands moved in practiced choreography, and the track eased with a small, telling groan. Ellis regarded Arthur with a new stillness, reading a man he had misjudged as if cataloging a tool. Respect arrived in practical measures, in adjustments of posture, and in the quiet that follows proof. Men stopped planning quips and began to note where work needed doing. Later they sat with a spread of paperwork, and cups passed without fanfare. And Arthur let a memory out in a line. He said he had been at Sanh when convoys sank in mud, and men were counted at dawn. The detail was brief, stark, and it gave weight to the taps. Tom tightened his mouth at that line, and felt the world incline. The rhythm now referencing a history that had teeth. Men who had laughed now listened as if someone had cleared the air and asked them to be still. The taps were no longer an oddity. They were evidence. They ran more drills, and Arthur's method became a protocol the men could follow. He tapped. Someone dug. The seam loosened, and a vehicle moved. Each success was a small proof, cumulative and unglamorous. Trust settled into the routine because it pays dividends in work. Ellis found a folded scrap in his jacket, a small sketch of marks that read like the taps Arthur used. It was older than any of them, and the sight of it made words unnecessary. Proof sat in pencil scratches, and that proof reshaped how men regarded what had been done without being told why. A vehicle later slid into a shallow hollow and jammed, metal biting at earth. Men worked with tools and muttered curses, the language of immediate repair. Arthur moved among them and tapped a short, precise sequence that described the pressure beneath the tread. They followed his taps and dug at those points. Muscle and mind synced for a narrow purpose. The vehicle freed after measured toil, and the success was plain and useful. The squad felt a change, less loud and more attentive, as if a new rule had written itself into their practice. Back in a quiet moment, a badge fell from Arthur's pocket when he turned to check a lug, and he caught it with a quick, private motion. The badge was worn soft and scored, the kind of small thing that carries long days. Arthur slid it away, and no one asked about its provenance, because the badge spoke in a language of its own. Tom asked, blunt and young, how a man learns to hear the metal. Arthur gave a method and a small exercise, and Tom bent his head and tried. The taps felt awkward at first, and then steadied, and Tom felt a small, honest pride that was not the same as mocking. Ellis received an order for a longer run, a route that would press the convoy across ground where judgment mattered more than muscle. The directive was practical and exact. It asked for care, not noise. Men checked straps and seats with a steadier focus and loaded with hands that accepted the task. They set out, and the convoy moved with a different cadence, less swagger and more attention. Tom pocketed his wooden wedge and kept glances toward Arthur that were both question and a promise. Arthur returned one small nod, the kind that grants permission to a man starting to learn. There was a hush as they approached the test ground, the kind of quiet that means something must be proved in motion. The men took up their places, and the convoy slowed into the run, ready to see if an old rhythm could keep a string of vehicles from sinking into a mistake repeated. They edged into the test ground with a focused hush. Arthur rode near the rear, fingers near metal, the way a reader keeps thumb on a page. Tom stayed close, wedge in his pocket, eyes fixed on the pattern of motion. A lead vehicle slowed and a line of men bent to brute work. Arthur tapped once, twice, 3 times, the notes like a map for those who would listen. The taps named pressure and seam, and the men set pry bars where he indicated without fuss. Ellis watched the marks, and his face tightened. A quiet that was not surprise, but attention given where it was due. Arthur said a single name from a long ago, Sanh, and they took the detail like a coordinate. The mention shifted what they did from testing to duty. Wheel marks ahead showed a staggered spoor that set Tom's stomach tight because it echoed the pattern Arthur had mentioned. The line moved with tension, each vehicle careful not to bite where weight would trap it. Arthur's hands went to the track, and he tapped in a metronome that the men could follow. A vehicle began to sink at a narrow cut, and men strained with poles and harnesses. Arthur altered his rhythm, and the pattern changed the way load sat on the tread. Men shifted weight by inches, and the vehicle found purchase. A hard, useful release that tasted of effort rather than drama. Tom worked with a fierce, new steadiness, and Ellis kept a patient watch, stopping anyone who would rush. The yard's earlier noise had given way to a compact focus, respect grown from proof. The convoy pressed on because the method proved itself under strain. At a pause, Arthur drew a dented badge from his pocket and turned it between fingers as if feeling a story in the metal. Ellis glanced and made no remark. He only filed the fact in the ledger of how men had behaved. The badge was small proof, and that proof changed how they stood beside one another. They prepared for the final run, and men checked straps with the strict care of those who have learned to trust method over bravado. Orders came down precise, asking for measured moves, not improvisation. The convoy set out with a different cadence, less swagger and more attention to detail. As they entered a narrow channel, Arthur recognized the same staggered enemy pattern that had once cost men in a different war. He said the shape calmly and placed his hammer in hand, tapping a slow rhythm that rearranged where weight would fall. The taps became commands, and the men followed, moving jacks and bars in time. At the narrowest point, a rear vehicle sank deep, and the line held its breath. Men pushed and cursed, arms burning with effort. Arthur shifted the sequence into a firmer beat, each strike a small order that the crew executed without pause. The vehicle freed with a final, stubborn heave, and an exhausted cheer rose like a relief exhaled. When they halted afterwards, Ellis walked to Arthur and took his hand, a plain gesture that carried recognition. He did not make a speech. He read a short note aloud, and the line heard a name and a signature that placed Arthur where records had already sat. The paper confirmed what action had shown, and the men needed no ceremony. Tom passed the dented badge back, and Arthur set his palm over it for a moment, as if closing a file. Then he placed the badge into Tom's hand, an unadorned transfer of trust. The action was small and absolute, an instruction given as if to say, "Keep this and use it well." They prepared to return, convoy moving with a calmer order and a story folded into its practice. Men spoke less and did more, the new rule written into the cadence of their tasks. Arthur kept his hammer at his side, silent and steady, and the badge in Tom's pocket was a warm, quiet promise. Ellis filed the method into routine, a line in a book that would make the taps a checked procedure rather than a tale. He gave the men one practical instruction, that the rhythm be taught and tested. It was not praise, it was training, and the men received it with the sober satisfaction of work done right. Tom looked at Arthur and felt a sense of duty that was not mimicry anymore. He tapped his own palm where the wedge lay and practiced a subtle beat, learning the language that had kept men safe. Arthur nodded once, and the nod carried thanks and a rare ease. They returned to the yard and set about ordinary tasks. But the quiet between them had shifted. The convoy had been saved by a rhythm and a man, and that fact lived in hands and in a small badge. Arthur kept his silence and his hammer, and the younger men kept a piece of his practice with them, a method that would travel farther than any single day. Some stories end with medals, others with silence. Men like Arthur Bennett never asked for either. They left behind rhythms, habits, small things that kept others alive. If you've ever known someone like that, someone who taught through quiet action, then you already understand what heroism sounds like. There are more of them, waiting in hangars, workshops, depots, still whispering through the work they left behind. Stay with us. Hear their echoes, because the world still turns on the hands of quiet heroes.